Welcome to the Voice of the Agent, our survey of what the industry really thinks is going on. We've already done part 1 and part 2 where we had panel debates about what people really thought was going on with sales, lettings, marketing, PropTech, AI, sustainability and portals. We're going to more sensitive areas, a bit more kind of difficult stuff in terms of economics, politics, the housing market and regulation. And I am delighted to invite Mike Day as our guest, industry legend, more letters in his name than after it, as I understand.
No, more letters after my name than in it.
Oh, that's the way around. I knew I'd screw that, but we're not going to stop that. We're going to keep rolling on that front.
Keep rolling.
But yes, lots of letters.
Indeed.
You also know to have quite strong views.
Sometimes.
So I'm really looking forward to getting into this. Now, we've spoken before about various things in the industry. So, and we'll probably go off piste a little bit, kind of conversations that we've had. But one of the pieces of research we found was that 3/4 of agents now support mandatory qualification. Is the industry finally ready to professionalise, and what stopped it until now?
Couple of things. Your survey actually showed that something like 2/3 of the respondents were qualified people. So maybe there's an element of,
Just on that, because you asked that question before, and I want to be saying that I took out the people who are qualified. 2/3 of the people who aren't qualified think we should be qualified.
Great. Okay, that's fine. I think the industry has always suggested that it would like to go down this route, and of course the public have always wanted this route, but we know that the public doesn't want to pay for it. The same is a little bit true in the industry. One of the reasons why it hasn't happened is that we've had, I guess the first major regulation in the estate agency sector was the Estate Agents Act 79. So whatever that is, best part of 50 years ago now. Section 22 was never introduced. Section 22 is about competency and would have led to the requirement for mandatory licensing or qualification or whatever. Successive governments have always preferred competition to competency, and therefore the incentive perhaps hasn't been there. And I don't think enough agents perceive compliance, regulation and whatever as a business winning part of their operation. I think they're wrong, and we can talk about that. But the simple fact is it's not the sexiest thing. It's not like putting something on Rightmove with a nice banner, and that I think has held people back. They don't perceive enough benefit in it for them.
And the reality is, we probably both know them. You can be incompetent from a pure technical competence perspective. You can be a little bit dishonest. You can operate some quite sharp practices and be a very successful agent. So isn't that kind of, be devil's advocate, we don't need this competence tests, or even to be, I know we should be compliant, we're legally obliged to be compliant, but a lot of people get away without being compliant and they're doing okay.
Well, that leads on to the whole question of how do we improve things and whatever.
That's what I want to know.
And of course, enforcement is one of the key things. We talk about we need better regulation, etc., etc. I'm certainly not convinced about that. I think we've got tons of regulation. What we haven't got is consistent, well organized and understood enforcement of that regulation. So of course the plans for ROPA, which have been kicking around now, and I said at the time it wouldn't happen during my career lifetime. That is definitely going to be an accurate prediction. Was about leading possibly to licensing and whatever, because unless you can take it away from somebody, and you can ban somebody under the Estate Agents Act now, but it's got to be a pretty heinous crime to get to that point. It's not like an annual license where you can just pull the plug on people. And so unless we get to that stage, I think we will always have this mismatch. I know that one of the things looked at was the sort of scenario with experience versus qualifications. And there's an awful lot of people in the industry, been around the industry for donkey's years, who haven't got qualifications, who might be fantastic. Perfectly compliant, damn good estate agents, etc., etc. And then there are people who've got qualifications who, quite frankly, are at the other end of the scale. Having said that, experience in itself doesn't mean knowledge or whatever. And of course, what are you testing with qualifications? You're testing knowledge. You're not actually testing competency. It's like, I know that the Battle of Hastings was 1066, but that's just a fact. That's knowledge.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually tell me the story around it and how it works.
The theory driving test doesn't mean you can drive.
Correct.
You can pass the theory, doesn't mean you can drive. You can be an excellent driver. Most of us are from our generation. We drive, but we haven't done the theory test.
Driver, obviously, out there.
Our rival, we also both drive excellent EVs, which is obviously the way to drive. I want to really get into this because actually it's a really good point, and we've talked about this before. Is the report, the research, the feedback we're getting, this is from over 400 agents saying, they see regulation as scattergun and toothless. Mm-hmm. And you talk about governments that favour competition over competence, which is a great phrase. And actually, I see a lot of truth in it, complete truth in it. How do we get a government to do the enforcement? If there is enough law there, if there is enough regulation, but it's completely toothless and scattergun, we're not going to improve this industry. What do we do?
Whilst housing and the property market is probably the most important or as important sector, because it affects everybody, whether you're living in a cardboard box under a bridge or you're buying a mansion in the Shires, everybody needs a roof over their heads and whatever. So it affects absolutely every part of the population in some way, shape or form. But of course, we have a government system that changes every 5 years because of the electoral system. How many housing ministers have we had over the last 20 years?
So
dozens.
many, and it's so bad for the industry.
And so there's no consistency there. Lots of short-termism. We've been obviously in Europe, now out of Europe. A lot of our regulation in areas like money laundering, and that effectively came out of our involvement with the EU. So we've got lots of different sort of levers and pulls and pushes on how we operate. And unless one sort of like threw it all away and started from scratch, I think we're going to be in that sort of mismatch type scenario for some time. And we've got a whole range of different organisations involved. So on one level, you've got trading standards at the basic sort of level. You've now got, on parts of what affects agents, you've got the Competition and Markets Authority. You've got the ICO from a data point of view. You've got HMRC from an AML point of view. Now that's fine, but you've got lots of different things that need to stack up and pull together. We have, from the consumer's point of view, in the last 25 years, now got an ombudsman system, a redress system, which is was a big step forward, and generally I would say works reasonably well. And so if you're looking at it from the point of view of saying how do we protect the consumer, that does help, because without membership of a redress scheme, as you know, you can't trade.
Yeah.
So that's almost as fundamental as anything else. But then we've obviously had things like the introduction of HIPs and the removal of HIPs. Big discussion about whether or not that was the right thing to do, but nevertheless, it was all designed to give people the information to make informed choices. And if you look at all consumer legislation, it's all about transparency, fairness, and people having the right information to take the right decisions at the right time.
So I talked about Verona Frankish, the CEO of Yopa, earlier about this. It's almost like, is this a sort of like it's a sense of despair that nothing is going to change fundamentally, and we just have to accept that is the state of the industry we're going to operate in. People's most valuable asset, the roof above people's heads, as you say, but we're going to accept it's still always going to be a little bit Wild West in the way it operates? Or do you feel that actually we are making enough steps in the right direction, and we could or will make more steps in the right direction, or we're not?
I think, this is my 50th year in the industry.
That's why you're here, because you know this industry more than most.
Let me tell you, in that 50 years, so this is the contribution I've helped make, okay, in that 50 years.
It's all your fault.
Yep. The fees as a percentage of price have gone down.
Mm-hmm.
The quality and productivity of staff, generalisation, has gone down. And the speed of a transaction has doubled.
Yeah.
Wow. Pretty impressive, eh?
You're not totally responsible.
No, I'm not going to just totally accept the blame either. But so you can look at some of this stuff and say, well, where's it making a difference? I think that we also obviously have to work with other professionals in the sector. If we're talking about, I mean, we've got lettings and there's a ton of stuff around lettings, but if we talk about house sales for a moment, you've got conveyancers. Okay, so a very important part, obviously an essential part of the process. You've generally got a lender or somebody involved in either redeeming or providing financing, and then you've probably got an agent in there as well, maybe a surveyor, one or two. So you've got a number of different sort of component parts there that need to join up. Some of that has got joined up. I mean, back in my days as a director of Connells, you know, we set up the conveyancing operation 25 years ago, and that actually sped up the process because of the way we got excuse me, people introduced right at the outset of a transaction. And I'm still a great believer in that type of approach. And we can talk about material information and whatever
we will.
as we go along. But it's very fragmented. It's a cottage industry. There's some stats out the other week. There are now 25,000 plus separate firms operating in the sector. Now, some of these firms are one man or one woman operating from a back bedroom or whatever, doing incredibly low volumes really of work, but nevertheless they're there and operating and doing their bit. Some of them extremely well, some of them possibly less so. So it's very fragmented, very fragmented. And the only way you'll change it would be the introduction of some sort of mandatory requirements, which is going to put the costs up, probably will eliminate a big chunk of this, the marketplace, will make it more expensive for the consumer, and it will be a slightly unknown guess as to how much improvement it brings.
Would you want that to happen?
No.
Tell me why you wouldn't want that to happen.
Because I believe that we've got the market that actually people deserve. We've got, well, at the end of the day, if the estate agency sector can't explain itself to the consumer and justify whatever level of fee needs to be appropriate, we've seen the emergence. I mean, you know, Verona was here. You know, the OPA model is a lower cost sort of, you know, fixed cost type basis operation. We've seen the purple bricksies and these sort of operations arrive, and all of those have driven the thing more towards a commoditized service. That doesn't go with, you know, raising the standards in the way that we're talking about. If you use IT, AI, prop tech and whatever, you can obviously use that to do the heavy lifting and reduce some of the costs. But it has turned an awful lot of the people who operate in estate agents into automatons, really. You know, they're robots. They're not adding the value of the people bit. They're not understanding you know, what people are looking for. So I know you personally are looking to move house at this moment in time, and you will have your reasons why you want to do that, and you know what you're looking for, why, you know, the things that are key to you. Unless your agent understands that and gets under the skin of that and works with you on that, it becomes a bit of a problem. Otherwise, you're just a number in a system, and it'll just keep spouting out the wrong type of property to you.
Feel very much like a number in the system, to be honest with you. I mean, that's interesting. We'll get on to material information in a second in the next question, but I mean, it's interesting what you say about how so much of the industry, automated AI, that kind of stuff is. I used to work in the media, national newspapers, and we actually had a paper that came out in I think it was 2000, even late 1990s. They said you'd see media divide into two worlds. There would remain this high-end print version, almost expensive kind of for the elite, for want of a better term. Everyone else would consume their media through social media or online, and it would be real free access, but it would be a race to the bottom in terms of quality. So you get high-end journalism, investigative journalism at the top elite, national, global newspapers probably, and then the rest. Is that the way the industry is going to move, do you think?
Well, I think it is already segmenting a little bit that way, in so much that you've got, you know, we can name the sort of, you know, the high-end firms. Let's call them Knight Frank and Savills and these sort of firms. You know, that they tend to operate in the middle and upper sort of, you know, marketplaces. they're not generally sort of fee-cutting operations. They're delivering a level of marketing and service and quality and whatever. And then you've got the other end of the scale, the sort of purple bricks type end of the thing, which is an execution-only type service, which is much, much cheaper. And that possibly has its marketplace as well. As you know, I did some research myself for my MBA 25 years ago, and it effectively predicted the arrival of people like purple bricks and whatever, because there was no doubt that the internet was going to drive it that way. I still think it hasn't found the different levels yet. I think there's still more to come. And with the introduction of AI, you know, and I know there's a lot talked about AI, and it's a much bandied phrase, and it's not always, you know, it's machine learning or whatever. But look at what discussions they're having around the boardroom table at Rightmove and Zoopla and these sort of places. Because if I can go into Google or whatever and sort of describe everything that I'm about, they can find it.
Yes.
I don't need to go to Rightmove and whatever else. And so that, you know, every part of the sector is facing some huge challenges. The challenge when it comes to regulation, to me, is for agents to embrace it, because it's not going to go away. We're not going to suddenly throw away money laundering regulation. We're not going to throw away, you know, some of the stuff we've got in place. It's for them to embrace it and use it as a business enhancer, rather than seeing it, which many do, as a business restrainer. And they've got to do it anyway. Otherwise they're breaking the law. Now, that calls into question enforcement, but basically, you know, legally they've got to do this stuff. But if they embraced it and brought it into every part of their operation, so it was integral to how they do things, they'd get to know more about their customers. They'd build up better relationships with their customers, longer relationships with their customers. All the best agents will tell you about how much of their business comes from recommendations and this sort of stuff, of course. And that's great, and I'm sure it's true. But there's more they could do to encourage that and build that relationship. All too often it's hand the keys over and then bye-bye, and I hope that you come back to me in 10 years' time.
I find it hilarious that I can buy an iPhone £1,000, not that you pay £1,000 because you always pay in your contract, and it comes in this beautifully ergonomically designed box that opens with that perfect as it opens. You get a key to a house, you just give them the keys. It's like, that's worth 750 times that's worth, or whatever it happens to be, multiples wise. It's like, but they go, why do I get a worse treatment on that than I do on this bit of tech? It's very, very strange. We talked about material information. I do want to bring it up because obviously you are in many ways a guru on this whole kind of world of compliance and material information. The site is widely ignored, material information rules. Is the lack of enforcement kind of like that's the canary in the coal mine that is undermining the trust across everything else?
Well, there's an expression, caveat emptor. Okay, you're old enough to remember this from your Roman days.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Daily.
So caveat emptor is let the buyer beware, and it was always up to the buyer or a tenant or whoever, the consumer acquiring, to find out what they needed to find out to satisfy themselves. And that was the way everything operated. We then get various sets of consumer regulation. Property Misdescriptions Act 91 came in 93, followed by the Consumer Protection Against Unfair Trading in 2008. That's now been superseded by the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Act.
Catchy.
It all rolls off the tongue, this stuff. But the basic thrust of all of it has been about being fair, transparent, people having the information they need when they did. Now, the Property Misdescriptions Act was specific to the property sector, very specific. In fact, there was 33 specified matters, and you had to, if you were dealing with those 33 elements, you had to be right. Once that moved out of the way and it was repealed in 2013, we're suddenly dealing with consumer protection regulation that deals with property, widgets, Mars bars, you name it, right across the board. So it's very difficult to sort of apply the same rules to, I mean, it's a bit different what you get told when you're buying a Mars bar to when you're buying a 16th century property or something, so where do you draw these lines? And bluntly, that's where the lawyers have always in the past been making the inquiries, finding out this information. The agent has been interested really in the sort of the gloss bit, that's, you know, putting it out there.
Yeah.
And then it's been caveat emptor has cut in a bit, and it's up to the buyer to do. That got turned round with the consumer protection regs. And so it was about providing people with this information rather than them having to go and find it. But it didn't kill caveat emptor. There's still an obligation there effectively. My house, for example, in South Buckinghamshire, I'm not allowed to hold a fun fair in my back garden. Now, obviously, that's been a major source of disappointment.
I'm so
to me.
looking forward to coming to
I
a fun
know,
fair at your house.
but if you were Michael Jackson, as was, maybe that would have been an important factor in deciding whether you wanted to buy my house or not. For the vast majority of people, they couldn't give a monkeys. Okay. So if you were interested in holding, that's the sort of, you'd make a specific inquiry. You wouldn't expect the agent to have flagged that to every, because it's irrelevant. So we're now in this state, of course, where what is material information? And of course, you've got the one man's meat is another man's poison type situation. The only way I can describe it is to apply what I call the acid test. And that is that if you look in the mirror and you say to yourself, if I was buying this property or renting this property, would I want to know this? And if the answer to that is yes, then it's something that should be revealed. Trading standards tried to come up with a sort of a slightly sort of tick boxy type approach to some of these items. Valiant attempt, but it by no means covered the whole thing. And enforcement was non-existent.
Yeah.
And we've now got the Competition and Markets Authority, and they've already said that pretty much for the next year, there will be no enforcement of it. When they do come to start enforcing, I think they will be tougher than the trading standards, but I think they've got some other things. Pricing is a big thing for them at the moment. I think that they will look at what the agent does, and if the agent can demonstrate that they've taken reasonable steps, I think that the agent will be okay. The key to me is engaging the lawyer and the agent at the outset and producing, as you do in an auction, a sort of a legal pack. That would be the way forward as far as I see it.
Brilliant. So a big part of this report, we've done it every year since 2023, is about the whole regulation, qualification, all that kind of stuff. Going back to that, because obviously, you know, we need more enforcement on the regulation that already exists. Let's come back to qualification just briefly, and also licensing, because that's come up in other conversations I've had, is there is a concern that qualification itself would deter new entrants, because passing an exam is not the same as being able to drive, being the parallel. But also, if I've been in the industry for 30 years, 5 decades, what really is passing an exam? I would stop doing my trade because I didn't pass an exam. How could we recognise competence without gatekeeping?
Well, the counter argument is you say you don't try to do that, you have to pass the exams. And just because somebody, as I said earlier, just because somebody's been in the industry a long time doesn't mean they're up to speed with what's actually going on now. I mean, you know, I've got obviously clients, I've got about 1,500 estate agency clients. Obviously, they're all wonderful. But the
and you're open to more?
Yeah, and available for bar mitzvahs, weddings. You know. But the scenario is that I still get asked questions from, you know, lots of clients, potential clients, and I think, God, I'm surprised you don't know that, or you should know that. And people don't. It's very difficult to keep up to speed with this stuff. Now, just because you've got a qualification, you might have got it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, doesn't mean you're up to speed. But you do at least have to do some CPD, some lifelong learning. So you have to be able to demonstrate that you're trying to keep on top of this stuff. We need a few more high-profile cases of enforcement, you know, people getting sued, you know, big sort of story type stuff to bluntly scare people into
make examples
into the situation.
Brilliant. So again, this whole industry relies on qualification. How do you feel about licensing? The concept of, you know, you don't have to necessarily have a formal qualification or whatever, but it's basically you have to go through some process that says you are a legal, decent, honest person to trade. Well, formal licensing.
If you think about AML regulation, where you have to register for supervision with HMRC, they can conduct effectively a fit and proper test
Yeah.
on the people who run on the business, so they can pull the plug. And of course, if you haven't got that,
You can't trade.
you're out of trade. If you can't join an ombudsman, you can't join the ombudsman scheme without one of these things, so you're out of the trade. So there is some joining up of this stuff, but the number of agents who actually get turfed out every year is handfuls in the scheme of things. You know, it's not terribly robust. And of course, they're turfed out usually for some sort of fairly heinous financial crime. They're not turfed out, of course, for service delivery.
No.
You know, I mean, you can go to a wonderful restaurant, you go to a Michelin star restaurant, you could have lousy service one evening, but you know, it's still got the Michelin. I guess they might ultimately take the star away from somebody if they, but that's where the ombudsman comes in to try and protect the consumer, because they will deal with the sort of, the service delivery aspects. It's the sort of government, regulation sort of through HMRC and ICO and trading standards and the CMA, forget all of these acronyms, that really looks after that element. But we've got to throw people out. The advantage of licensing would mean, I think, that it would be easier then to kick people out.
Yeah.
And nobody, the public now, what question do they ask an estate agent when they have them round to value their house? How much is my house worth?
Yeah.
And what's your fee? That's
I was about to say, what's the house worth?
And that, and agents play to that.
Yeah.
In their advertising and marketing and whatever else. Very few members of the public say, "Oh, can you tell me what qualifications you've got, please?"
But you wouldn't go to a dentist without having some sense.
Well,
a dentist is a professional dentist.
Correct. And and a solicitor, you'd expect them to be a member of the SRA. Yes. Or the people don't ask that question. People, the pub. So there's an huge education piece, and this is where the professional bodies are failing.
And that lends itself perfectly to the next question. There are several industry bodies, but awareness of them is really, really low. I mean, we did a survey for part 1 of the Voice of the Agent, and I'm a huge fan of what Property Mark does and the NAEA and ALA and all that kind of stuff. But the awareness of Property Mark was about 6%. And the awareness of the NAEA and ALA, which obviously the lettings and sales kind of parts of it, you're very familiar with them, again, single digit. Ricks did well, 43%. A third couldn't name a single one, didn't recognise a single one. And this wasn't unprompted. This was the names actually published. People just didn't know who they were. That's a fundamental problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Property Mark, didn't exist, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever. It's sort of rebranding itself and pulling the different, because of course it's got NAVA as well, which is the auctioneers and inventories and bits and pieces. Pulling them all under this one brand, the Property Mark brand. And it has done a great job, particularly within the industry. And the number of people going through the education and Property Mark provides and whatever has increased. It's got 18,000 members now. But you think 18,000 members, how many people operate in the estate agency sector? Now, I don't know the answer, but it's over 100,000.
Yes, yeah.
It
goes high.
There's 25,000 businesses.
Yeah.
Then you've got the RICS. Now, they've got, way bigger, okay, but it's a broad church because it's quantity surveyors, it's all sorts of different global. There's only about 4,000 or 5,000 people who are RICS members who would list estate agency on their list of activities. I'm an RICS member, as you know, and I used to chair the residential faculty, and we had the clout because we had a royal charter and whatever else, but we just didn't have the membership. In fact, during my time there, we tried to merge with the NAEA as it was at the time and bring the NAEA in as our residential wing. And that would have probably been quite a good thing to have happened. The reason the NAEA attracts more recognition is, funnily enough, is in the name. The National Association of Estate Agents.
Yeah.
So
the Association of Residential Lettings Agents.
It says what it is. Yeah. Okay. Now, Property Mark can overcome that, and I'm sure you're the man who could help them, Simon. But
Nathan, if you're listening.
But the reality is, I think they've done a really good job, and you were at the recent conference.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
They've done a fantastic job within the industry.
Yeah.
But outside of the industry, with consumers, and I know they keep dragging dear old Phil Spencer out for this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, they haven't got that recognition with the public. And they've still not in the main, apart from the disciples because there's some very passionate people within the property market, you walk down a high street still with estate agency offices, and you won't see it overly promoted in their sort of displays.
I find it really interesting because obviously you've got the Guild of Property Professionals, you've got the Federation of Independent Agents, you've got the Relocation Agent Network, obviously you've got Property Market, which is more the industry body.
Yep.
I am surprised when I walk past estate agents, because we all walk past estate agents all the time, how few of them make a thing that they are a member of one of those organisations, and that is almost a quality seal. They just don't talk about it. I mean, there's one local agent near us that still has the former name, forget what it was, of the Guild before it became the Guild of Property Professionals, the Guild of Professional Estate Agents. They've still got that logo. It's a really small, slightly damaged sticker in the
They've probably still got one of those Rightmove sort of, open stickers on the door.
Why do you think the industry doesn't want to get behind these things that, to me, when I see these things, is you're part of a group that gives you a measure of difference from your competitors. Why aren't they making more of it?
Well, I think they're wrong. Okay, but why aren't they? I think the fact is some of them are a little bit scared of it, in so much that I've joined this club, but I don't want to tell people too much about it in case somebody goes off and talks to me about them, and so I think there's that element a little bit. It's another logo, and we've all seen the letterheads and the window displays covered in logos, so that's good. Oh, we've got another logo, but that's not the thing. They're not using, as I said earlier, their professionalism as what part of their mix. They'll tell people about how much, how they advertise on Rightmove. They'll tell people about they're open 7 days a week. They'll tell people about all of this sort of stuff, and they don't talk about the professionalism and the quality of the people you're going to be dealing with. They're going to be looking after your best interests during the transaction. Estate agents rarely talk about, when they go to list a property, they rarely talk about getting that property through to completion. Okay, it's all the talk is about. What we'll do is we'll get it on the market in 5 minutes flat with some nice photographs and a floor plan and a video and whatever, and we'll get lots of buyers and we'll get you the best price. And the focus is there.
Going through that now.
And that's fine. And that's part of it. But it's of no use whatsoever unless ultimately the transaction goes through.
Yeah.
And there's a long journey behind that initial bit in terms of the legals and everything else that needs to. And I think agents should be talking more about the holistic journey. And
especially
I think
as they only get paid.
Well, ultimately, most agents only get paid. Okay, so that's where the model has changed.
Yeah.
Because these lower priced execution only services are often paid for partially or wholly up front.
Yeah.
So that has changed that dynamic a little bit. But nevertheless, that's a point of differentiation and something you could compete with. People used to moan when Purple Bricks first hit the scene about, whatever it was, 599 quid or whatever they started at. But you have to pay it up front. Well, as an agent, fine. Yeah, you've got to pay me 3,000 quid, 5,000 quid, whatever it might. But you only pay me out of success. So that was you could discuss that and deal with that.
I think, people don't, if you're outside the industry, you don't understand how good a deal that actually is. You only pay on success.
Absolutely.
That's a great deal.
But agents aren't looking at some of this, professional qualifications, as if you asked an agent to list their USPs, I wonder how many would put their membership of Property Mark or the fact that all of their people are qualified. Happens a bit more in lettings, funnily enough, than it does in sales. And probably that's because Arla, within the letting sphere, actually has greater penetration within, because it's really the only sort of dedicated
such a valuable
one there. So it has a better penetration within the lettings market than, for example, the estate agency NAEA side of things. Also, of course, there's a ton more legislation and stuff to deal with in lettings. So it's perceived as more important, and it's easier to get that across to a landlord as to why you should use me, because not only am I going to find you a tenant, but I'm then going to look after your property all the time. So what they have there is that ongoing relationship.
Yes.
Whereas estate agency is still seen quite often as a series of sort of one-off transactions. And I think that does subconsciously or consciously affects people's thinking.
I really do see the difference in the industry for the last decade. But if you're not a member of Property Mark or not been to PM1, do look them up, because they've got so much information. So generally recommend them. I'm no commission from them in terms of saying that. I just think as an industry, we've got some really good bodies. It's a bit of a soup, the whole kind of the number of organizations and things. So go on then. Final question to me in terms of, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. Also, like, more of a crystal ball. It's like you're going to be the emperor of the industry. I think you should be the emperor of the industry. If you could design a regulatory system from scratch, pragmatic, proportionate, and respected, what would it look like?
It would be light touch. It would still retain the ethos of caveat emptor, but it would probably have some levels of mandation within it about what, for example, a seller of a property do. So the seller of a property would have to instruct the lawyer at the same time as, so the home information pack, go back to that.
Yeah.
It was mandatory that you had to have a home information. It's mandatory that you have an EPC now.
Yeah.
Now, home information packs were far from perfect. If we'd have kept them, I'm pretty damn sure they would have evolved and found a place now that was fine. It meant sellers were more committed, buyers had more information up front. So a lot of that deals with an awful lot of the stuff. You're still going to have the occasional rogue and whatever, and fine. If that meant that everybody had to have a license to trade, you could take it away from them. But that license to trade, does that license to trade have to have a qualification backing it up? That's an interesting element. Most people say it does. I'm not 100% convinced that it does. I think providing you meet certain criteria, you could have a license without that. I'm not anti-qualifications, for Christ's sake. I've got them all.
Yeah.
And I would encourage everybody to have them all. What people like Property Mark have got to be a little bit mindful of the fact is that if suddenly we had Roper come in and everybody had to get a qualification, there's nothing to differentiate one person from a qualification with a qualification to another one. At the moment, if I'm an agent with a qualification and you're an agent without one, there's a point of differentiation that I can play up.
Absolutely.
And I would try and take advantage of that. But if we've both got to have it, well, that's gone out the window, hasn't it? It's a bit like we advertise on Rightmove, and sort of people say, well, doesn't everybody? So it's that type of scenario. So there's some commercial, there's a lot of commercial elements in this as well.
That has been enlightening. I knew it would be. Mike, thank you very much. Really insightful conversation. Actually, an area that I come from financial services where compliance is everything. So it's kind of like I'm used to the compliance world, but that's been a really enlightening discussion about how the compliance world would change. If you want to get in touch with Mike, you don't know him already, Integral Property Services, strongly recommend it. There aren't many people in the industry there isn't anyone in the industry. There aren't many people in the industry who know more about compliance than Mike. But thank you very much. Been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Cheers.